Vivian Carlisle stood in front of the barn for the first time in 11 years and tried to remember why her husband had laughed when the lawyer said it was hers. The barn was bigger than she remembered, or she was smaller. One of those things had to be true, because the building she had pictured on the long drive up from Asheville, the one she had described to her lawyer as a falling-down shed nobody wanted, was not the building in front of her. This was a real barn, 30 feet wide, 40 feet long, hand-hewn timbers darkened by 60 years of mountain weather, a roof that sagged in two places but had not given up, a padlock on the main door, rusted but holding, and a smaller door on the side, the one her father had used, with a brass handle she had touched 10,000 times as a child and forgotten she had ever known. She had not cried at the divorce hearing. She had not cried when Howard's lawyer slid the inventory sheet across the table. The lake house, the primary residence on Cedar Ridge, the boat, the 2 cars, the brokerage accounts he had quietly drained over 18 months while she was nursing her mother through a stroke. She had not cried when the judge approved the settlement. She had not cried when Howard, on his way out of the courtroom, paused beside her chair and said, in the voice of a man who had won, "Enjoy the bar, Viv. Maybe you can sell it for firewood." She cried now. Not hard, just enough that she had to take her glasses off and clean them on the hem of her jacket before she could see properly again. Then she walked up to the side door and put her hand on the brass handle. If you've ever stood in front of something the world told you was worthless and felt in your chest that the world might be wrong, hit the like button and subscribe to Left Behind. Drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're watching from. She had almost nothing left. She had no idea what was waiting. Keep watching. To understand why Howard laughed, you have to understand the 41 years that came before that courtroom. You have to understand who Vivian Carlisle had been when she married him, and who she had let herself become, and the slow, careful way a person can lose a life they were not paying close enough attention to. She had been Vivian Hale before she was Vivian Carlisle. She had grown up in a small wood frame house on the edge of Yancey County, North Carolina, where her father, Walter Hale, ran a cabinet shop out of the barn behind the house. Walter was a quiet man, broad-shouldered, with hands that had been working hands since he was 12 years old. He made furniture for people who knew what good furniture was, and he turned away customers who didn't, which meant he was never rich. He also restored antiques, pieces brought down from old family homes in Virginia and Tennessee, pieces other restorers wouldn't touch because the work was too fine and too slow. People drove 300 miles to leave a chair with Walter Hale. They drove 300 miles back to pick it up 6 months later. They paid what he asked because they had seen the work. Vivian had grown up in that barn. She had swept the shavings off the floor, organized the small drawers of brass hardware, learned the difference between cherry and walnut by smell before she could read. Her father had taught her to recognize a piece of furniture the way a doctor recognized a patient, by what it had survived, by what it carried, by what it was trying to tell you. She had been good at it. She had been better at it than she ever got credit for, because by the time she was old enough for it to matter, she had already met Howard Carlisle. Howard was 22 and going somewhere. That was how everyone described him, including Howard. He was studying business at Western Carolina. He had a plan, he had opinions, he had a way of walking into a room that made people pay attention. Vivian was 20 and working at the front desk of a small inn in Asheville, saving money she had not yet decided what to do with. Howard came in for a weekend trip with friends and noticed her, and over the next 6 months he came back for more times, and on the 5th visit he asked her to marry him on the porch of the inn at 10 o'clock at night. And she said yes because she was 20 and he was the most certain person she had ever met, and certainty looks like love when you are 20. Walter walked her down the aisle without saying a word about Howard, which was Walter's way of saying everything. She had understood it at the time and decided not to understand it. That was the first decision in a life that became, over the next 4 decades, a long, quiet sequence of decisions not to understand things she understood. Howard built a contracting business in Asheville. He was good at it. He was good at most things he chose to do, which was part of why he was the way he was. They had 2 children, Daniel, who was now 40, and Caroline, who was 37. They had a house on Cedar Ridge with a view of the Blue Ridge that visitors always commented on. They had vacations in Charleston and a lake house at Lake Lure that Howard had bought in 2003 because, he said, every successful man should own water. Vivian had raised the children, kept the house, hosted Howard's clients for dinner 4 nights a month for 30 years, learned to make 6 different versions of pot roast because Howard had opinions, and never gone back to her father's barn to do the work she had been good at because Howard had said, early on, that he didn't want his wife smelling like sawdust. She had let that sentence pass without challenging it. That was decision number 2. Walter died 8 years ago. He had been 79, and he had been working in the barn the morning of the day he died, and the cabinet he had been building was still on the bench when Vivian arrived from Asheville to find her mother sitting on the porch with the screen door open and the dog laying across her feet. Vivian had handled the arrangements. Howard had come for the funeral and complained about the drive. Her mother, Ruth, had moved into a small apartment in Burnsville 6 miles down the road and had refused, gently but completely, to come live in Asheville. "I'll stay near the barn," Ruth had said, which had seemed at the time like grief talking. Vivian understood now, standing in front of the side door 11 years too late, that her mother had not been talking about grief at all. Ruth had died 3 years after Walter. The funeral had been small. The barn had been left to Vivian in the will, along with the 14 acres around it, and Howard, who handled everything to do with paperwork, because Howard handled everything to do with paperwork, had filed it without comment under miscellaneous holdings and never spoken of it again. The property had been transferred to Vivian's name alone because that was how Walter had set it up in 1962, and changing it would have required Howard to drive to a county courthouse he considered beneath him, so he had simply not bothered. Vivian had not known any of this until her divorce attorney, a woman named Patricia Olmsted, had pulled the deed 3 weeks ago and said, almost as an afterthought, "There's a property up in Yancey County in your name only. Did you know about this?" Vivian had said yes. Then she had said, sort of. Then she had said, "It's just a barn." Howard always called it the Firewood Farm. Patricia had looked at her over her reading glasses for a long moment. "Has anyone been up there since your mother passed?" Howard had someone check on it once. He said it was falling down. Did he go himself? No. He sent a man. Patricia had made a small note in the margin of the file, and that note had been part of the reason the Firewood Farm had ended up on Vivian's side of the settlement without Howard's lawyer raising a single objection. Howard had laughed about it later in the parking lot. Vivian had heard him laugh. She had recognized the laugh. It was the same laugh he had used for 41 years on every subject he considered too small to take seriously, including, by the end, her. She had driven away from that courtroom in the used Subaru she had bought with the last of her own money, the money she had saved from selling small things over the years that Howard had not noticed her selling, and she had gone back to the temporary apartment her sister had helped her find, and she had sat on the bed for 2 days. On the 3rd day, she had taken out the deed Patricia Olmsted had given her, and she had read it carefully, the way her father had taught her to read documents, slowly, with attention to what was not said as well as what was. And she had noticed the 2nd page. The 2nd page was not part of the original deed. It was a single sheet of typed paper, folded once, paper clipped to the back. It was dated 1981. It was a notarized addendum filed by Walter Hale that designated the barn structure and its contents as a separate inventory from the land itself, with the contents to be held in trust for my daughter Vivian Lee Hale, sole and exclusive, in perpetuity. She had read it 3 times. She had not understood what it meant. She had only understood that her father, 12 years into her marriage, in 1981, had walked into a Yancey County courthouse and filed a piece of paper that placed something inside that barn beyond Howard Carlyle's reach forever. She had packed a bag the next morning. The drive from Asheville to the barn took 2 hours and 20 minutes. The last 40 minutes were on roads Vivian had not driven in over a decade, but her hands knew them. The Subaru handled the curves better than she expected. The trees were larger than she remembered, and the small town she passed through had thinned out the way mountain towns do. A gas station closed, a diner with new owners, a church she had been baptized and still standing and still painted white. She arrived at the property line at 3:20 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in late October. The leaves were past their peak, but still gold in the patches where the sun came through. The gravel drive up to the house was overgrown but passable. The house itself, her parents' house, where she had grown up, was boarded up and listing slightly to the left, the porch sagging the way old porches sag, the windows covered in plywood that had been put up by someone who knew how to put up plywood. She had not expected the barn to be in better condition than the house. She had not expected the barn to be in good condition at all, but it was. Standing in front of the side door now, with her hand on a brass handle, she took her first close look at the building, and what she saw did not match what Howard had told her for 11 years. The roof had 2 soft spots, but it was holding. The siding was weathered but sound. The foundation stones were level. Someone, and this was the part she could not yet make sense of, had replaced 4 of the boards along the lower edge of the north wall within the last year. The new wood was darker than the old, but not by much. Whoever had done it had matched the grain. Whoever had done it had used pegs in the old style instead of nails. Whoever had done it had known what the building was. She lifted the brass handle. The door opened easily. The smell came first. Cedar and linseed oil and the faint mineral smell of old iron. Beneath those, something her brain registered before her conscious mind did. The smell of recent work. Sawdust that was not yet old. The breath of a building that had been used inside the last 6 months. She stepped inside. The light came in through the high windows along the south wall, the way it had always come in long slanted bars that picked out the dust hanging in the air. The main room of the barn opened in front of her, and she stopped on the threshold because the main room of the barn was not what she had expected to find. The workshop was intact. Her father's workbench ran along the east wall, the long oak top scarred and scrubbed in equal measure, the vices mounted at both ends, the small drawers underneath labeled in his handwriting in a label marker tape that had yellowed but not lifted. The lathe stood in the middle of the floor, draped in a clean canvas cloth. The tool wall above the bench held his hand planes in their racks, his chisels in the leather roll-up he had made himself, his squares and gauges hung in the order he had hung them in for 50 years. None of it was dusty. The dust on the floor was new dust, the kind that accumulates over a season, not a decade. Everything else had been kept. In the center of the room, on a low stand her father had built for displaying finished pieces to clients, was a chair. A walnut side chair. 18th century by the look of it. The kind of chair Walter Hale had restored 100 of in his career. It had been finished. Not just repaired, finished. Hand-rubbed oil, the upholstery on the seat replaced with a linen and horsehair pad in the original style, the joints tight, the wood glowing in the late afternoon light, the way only wood that has been worked by someone who loved it can glow. There was a small card on the seat. White cardstock, folded once. Vivian crossed the room slowly. Her boots made the floor creak in the same places it had creaked when she was 9 years old. She picked up the card. She opened it. Her father's handwriting. She would have known it in any room in the world. If you're reading this, you came home. I'm sorry it took what it took. There is more to find. Take your time. Daddy, she sat down on the floor. She did not cry this time. She had cried earlier in the day, at the door, and she had used up that crying for the moment. She just sat on the wide pine boards of her father's workshop floor with the card in her hand, and she looked at the chair he had finished for her, and she tried to do the math. Walter had died 8 years ago. The chair had been finished by hands that knew what they were doing. The note was in his handwriting. The dust on the floor was less than a year old. Someone had been keeping the building. Someone had been keeping it for her. She did not know how long she sat there. Long enough that the bars of light through the high windows shifted from gold to amber to the deeper orange that meant the sun was starting to drop behind the ridge. She finally stood up, slowly, the way a 68-year-old woman who has just driven 2 hours and 20 minutes stands up from a wooden floor, and she walked the perimeter of the workshop with the card still in her hand. That was when she noticed the second door. It was at the back of the workshop, behind the lathe, behind the canvas cover, behind the long bench where Walter had sharpened his blades. She had not noticed it as a child because it had been hidden behind a pegboard shelf that no longer existed. She had not noticed it in her first sweep of the room because her eyes had been on the chair. It was a narrow door, plank-built, the kind of door a man might put on a back closet for storing finishing supplies. There was a padlock on it. The padlock was new. Stainless steel, shiny in the slanting light, the kind you bought at the hardware store last week. A new padlock on an old door in a barn nobody had been to in 11 years. Vivian Carlisle stood in front of that door for a long time. The chair was behind her. The card was in her pocket now. The Subaru was outside in the dirt with her one suitcase still in the trunk. The sun was going. Her phone had no signal. She had checked to the property line, and the nearest town was 12 miles away. She was a 68-year-old woman alone in a barn that someone had been maintaining without her knowledge for an unknown period of time. She should have been afraid. She was not afraid. She was something else. Something she had not felt in so long she almost didn't recognize it. And when she did recognize it, she had to lean against the workbench for a moment because of how strange it felt to feel it again at her age. It was the feeling of being addressed, of being expected, of having walked into a room that had been arranged with care for her arrival by someone who had not lived to see it, and someone else who had. The padlock was new, which meant someone had put it there recently, which meant someone, somewhere, had a key. She turned and walked back through the workshop, past the chair on its stand, past the workbench, past the small drawers labeled in her father's hand. She closed the side door behind her and stood on the gravel in the failing light. A truck was coming up the drive. The truck was a green Ford, older than the Subaru, and it pulled to a stop 10 feet from her with the slow, deliberate care of a vehicle whose driver had been driving up this same gravel for a long time. The engine cut. The driver's door opened. A man got out. He was perhaps 60, lean and weathered the way men who work outside become weathered, with a flannel shirt and a gray beard cut close, and he stood for a moment beside the truck with his hand on the open door, looking at her, the way a man looks at something he has been waiting to see and is now not entirely sure how to greet. "Mrs. Carlisle," he said. "Vivian," she said. "Just Vivian." He nodded as if he had been hoping she would say that. He shut the truck door. He walked toward her with no hurry, the gravel popping under his boots, and stopped at a polite distance and put out his hand. "Earl Whitfield," he said. "A word for your father." She took his hand. His grip was the grip of a man who knew the difference between strong and rough, and used the first only. "I remember you," she said, and she did, suddenly, the way a name remembers itself when the face arrives in front of it. "You were the apprentice, the one who came down from Spruce Pine. You were 16. I was 18. Looked 16. A small smile brief. Your father always said I'd grow into my face. Took me until about 40. She laughed before she remembered she was supposed to be cautious. The laugh came out small and surprised, and Earl seemed to take it as permission, because he tilted his head toward the barn. "I see you found the chair," he said. "You finished it." He did most of it. The joinery, the carving on the splat, all the hard parts. Last 6 months of his life. I did the oil and the seat. He told me which oil. Told me how many coats. Told me how to mix the horsehair. Earl looked at the barn, not at her. He told me a lot of things in those 6 months. He knew what he was doing. "You've been keeping the building." "Yes, ma'am." "For 11 years." "Yes, ma'am." Vivian did not know what to do with her hands. She put them in the pockets of her jacket. "Why?" Earl looked at her then, and his face did something that she would think about later in the cabin she would eventually rent in Burnsville while the work was being done on the house. His face did the thing a man's face does when he has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just been asked, finally, by the right person, why he was carrying it. "Because he asked me to," Earl said. "And because your mother paid me to. And after she passed, because the trust paid me to. And because by then I'd been doing it long enough that stopping seemed like the wrong thing." "The trust," Vivian said. Earl looked at her for a long moment. "Mrs. Carlisle." "Vivian, I think we should sit down for this part." They sat on the porch of her parents' boarded-up house, on the 2 cane chairs that had been left there because they were not worth taking. Earl Whitfield rolled a cigarette with hands that had been rolling cigarettes for a long time and did not light it, just held it between his fingers while he talked. The sun was almost behind the ridge. The light on the barn turned the unpainted siding the color of dark honey. Walter Hale, Earl said, had not been a poor man. Walter Hale had been very good at what he did, and the people he had done it for had been, in many cases, very wealthy, and over the course of 51 years of restoring fine American furniture for collectors who had inherited it from grandparents and great-grandparents, Walter had been paid not only in money, but occasionally in pieces. A federal sideboard that the owner could not afford the restoration on, and offered instead. A pair of queen and side chairs that came in for repair and were left by the family that brought them when the family decided they no longer wanted to be a family that owned them. A tall case clock from a Charleston estate that had been signed inside the case by a maker whose name Walter had recognized and whose recognition the family had not. He bought a few too, Earl said, when he had cash, and something came through the shop that he couldn't bear to send back out. He had an eye. You know, he had an eye. I know. Your mother knew, too. She was the bookkeeper. She kept the records. Where are they? Earl tipped his head toward the barn. In there. In there. Vivian looked at the barn in the failing light. Then she looked back at Earl Whitfield. How many? Earl took a slow breath through his nose. He looked at the cigarette in his hand. He put it back in his shirt pocket without lighting it. Vivian, he said, I think it's better if you see. If this story has found its way to you, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story from Left Behind. Your support is what keeps these stories coming, and there are so many more waiting to be told. He had a key on a small ring that he kept in the glove box of the truck. He explained this on the walk back across the gravel, in the apologetic tone of a man who had thought about the security arrangements more than he was comfortable admitting. The padlock was his addition, he said. He put it on 3 years ago, after a couple of hunters had wandered too close to the property line one fall. The original lock, the one Walter had used, was an older brass mechanism that any determined teenager could have picked with a paperclip. Earl had upgraded. Did you ever go in? Vivian asked. Past the door. Once a year. To check for damp. To check for mice. To make sure the climate was holding. The climate. Your father insulated that room himself in 1979. Cedar planking inside, then a layer of cork, then more cedar. He said wood needs to breathe, but it doesn't need to drink. The room holds its temperature within about 6 degrees year-round. I check the hygrometer. I rotate the silica. I don't touch anything else. He unlocked the padlock. He stepped aside. Vivian opened the door. The room behind the door was longer than she expected. It ran the full depth of the barn, 25 feet at least, narrow but tall, with a single high window covered by a wooden shutter that Earl reached up and opened, letting the last of the afternoon light come through in a slow honey-colored bar. The walls were cedar, pale and clean. The floor was cedar. The smell was a smell she would not have been able to name a year ago and could not stop naming now. Old wood, slow oil, the breath of furniture that has been resting. The furniture was everywhere. Not stacked, not crowded, arranged. Walter had arranged it the way a curator arranges a gallery, with space between the pieces, with sight lines. With each object given the room, it needed to be itself. A federal sideboard along the far wall, mahogany with satinwood inlay, the brass poles catching the light. A pair of queen and side chairs flanking a small Pembroke table. A tall case clock in the back corner, its bonnet just clearing the rafter, the dial showing the correct time. A Hepplewhite secretary against the south wall. A blanket chest of figured maple. A wien sur sette. A cherry highboy. A spooled bed disassembled and laid carefully along the east wall on padded supports. Smaller things on shelves. A tea caddy. A writing slope. A candle stand. A small mirror in a gilt frame whose gilt had been redone by someone who knew how. Vivian counted 23 pieces before she stopped counting. There's an inventory, Earl said quietly behind her. Your mother kept it. Updated through the year she died. Your father kept appraisals on the major pieces. They're in the green binder on the shelf by the door. She did not turn around. She was looking at the tall case clock. What is it worth, Earl? A long silence behind her. She heard him shift his weight on the threshold. He was, she understood now, a man who had spent 11 years not saying the number out loud. The last appraisal your father had done was 2014, just on the major pieces. 11 of them. What was the number? Vivian, what was the number? $2.1 million, Earl said. On the 11 pieces. Not counting the smaller items. Not counting the secretary or the highboy because he hadn't had them appraised yet. Not counting the clock because the clock he wouldn't let anyone appraise. He said the clock wasn't for selling. She put her hand on the workbench in the outer room to steady herself. She had walked back out without realizing she was walking. The cool of the bench top under her palm. The grain of the oak under her fingers. Her father had built that bench in 1958. He had told her the year 100 times. 2.1 million, she said. In 2014. The market's gone up since. She heard herself laugh. It was not a happy laugh, and it was not a sad laugh. It was the laugh of a woman who had spent 41 years being told what she was worth by a man who had been wrong about everything that mattered. Howard, she said. Ma'am, my ex-husband. He took the lake house and the cars and the brokerage accounts. He left me the firewood farm. Earl Whitfield said nothing, but she heard, behind her, the very small sound of a man trying not to smile and not entirely succeeding. She slept that night in the cab of the Subaru, parked beside the barn, with the doors locked and her phone on the dashboard, showing no signal and the moon coming up over the ridge through the windshield. She did not sleep well. She woke twice. The second time she woke, around 3 in the morning, she sat up in the driver's seat and looked at the dark shape of the barn and understood, with the cold clarity that only comes at 3 in the morning, that Howard was going to find out. He was going to find out because Howard always found out. He had a man at the Yancey County Courthouse. Vivian did not know the man's name, but she knew Howard had him because Howard had men at every courthouse in the western half of the state. Howard would notice that she had driven somewhere. Howard would put it together. Howard would call a contractor he knew in Burnsville, and the contractor would mention that an old barn off Route 19 had been getting some attention lately, and Howard would put it together faster than that. She had maybe a week, maybe less. She sat in the Subaru and thought about her father, who had filed an addendum in 1981 to keep something safe for her in a marriage he had seen the shape of from the beginning. She thought about her mother, who had paid Earl Whitfield out of her own Social Security check for 3 years before the trust took over. She thought about Earl himself, sleeping in his own bed 12 miles away, having handed her a key he had carried for over a decade and gone home, because that was what the right kind of man did. She thought about the chair on the stand. If you're reading this, you came home. She got out of the Subaru at first light. The grass was wet. She walked back into the workshop and stood in front of her father's bench, and she put her hands flat on the oak top, and she made the first decision in 11 years that nobody else had made for her. She was not going to sell the pieces. She was going to finish what her father had started. She drove into Burnsville at 8 that morning. The diner on Main Street was still owned by the same family that had owned it when she was a girl, though the granddaughter ran it now, and the granddaughter did not recognize her, which Vivian counted as a small mercy. She ordered coffee and eggs. She borrowed the diner's Wi-Fi to send Patricia Olmsted a single email. I need to come see you. Tomorrow. I have something to discuss that may require a forensic accountant. She did not explain. Patricia did not ask. Patricia replied within 10 minutes with a time. She drove back up to the barn at noon, and Earl was already there, the green Ford parked beside the workshop, a thermos on the bumper, a notebook in his hand. He had brought the green binder out and laid on the workbench. He had brought also a man. Vivian, he said, this is Tom Reedy. He's been my contractor when I needed wood. He restored the porch on the Caldwell place over in Mitchell County. He knows what he's looking at, and he knows when not to talk about what he's looking at. Tom Reedy was 45 and built like a man who had carried beams for a living. He nodded at her once. He said, ma'am. He did not say anything else. I want to do 3 things, Vivian said. I want a complete inventory with current appraisals, by an appraiser who has never met my husband. I want the house, my parents' house, made sound enough to live in by spring. And I want this barn turned into a working shop again. Heating, lighting, climate control for the back room properly upgraded. A sign at the road. Not a big sign, just a sign that says it's open. Earl looked at her. Open for what? Work, Vivian said. I'm 68 years old, and I've forgotten more about restoring a federal sideboard than most men in this state ever knew. I want to start remembering. Earl Whitfield nodded slowly. He looked at Tom Reedy. Tom Reedy nodded once. I'll get you numbers by Friday, Tom said. Earl, Vivian said, I want you working with me. Full salary. Whatever the trust is paying you, double it. I want a written agreement. Vivian, you don't need to. I know I don't need to. I want to. My father underpaid you for 30 years because he could. I'm not going to. Earl looked at the floor of the workshop for a moment. When he looked up, his eyes were wet, and he did not pretend they weren't. All right, he said. All right, then. Howard found her on the 8th day. She had expected sooner. She would later learn from Patricia that Howard had spent the first 6 days assuming she had gone to her sister's, and the 7th day assuming she had gone to a friend's cabin in Boone. And only on the 8th day had one of his men called from Yancey County to mention that a woman in a Subaru had been seen in town 3 times that week, and that there was activity at the old Hale Place off Route 19, and that the activity included 2 pickup trucks and a man with a clipboard. The Mercedes came up the gravel drive at 4 in the afternoon. Vivian was on the porch of her parents' house with a cup of coffee, watching Tom Reedy's crew nail new tar paper to the south side of the roof. She had been expecting a car all afternoon. She had specifically been expecting this car. She had put on the red sweater because the red sweater had been her mother's, and because she wanted to be wearing something that came from this place when Howard arrived in it. He got out of the Mercedes the way he always got out of the Mercedes, with the door slam that was a little too hard and the suit jacket adjustment that was a little too studied. He looked at the house. He looked at the men on the roof. He looked at the barn that had a new metal roof going on over the soft spots and a new hand-painted sign at the gate that said W. Hale and Daughter Restoration, and his face did something that Vivian had been waiting 41 years to see it do. It went still. Howard Carlisle, in 41 years of marriage, had never been still. "Vivian," he said. His voice was careful. "What is going on here?" "I'm renovating my barn," Vivian said. "Hello, Howard. You're—" He looked at the sign again. He looked at the trucks. He looked back at her. "What is this?" "This is what you left me, Howard. Remember? You said I could sell it for firewood." A man got out of the passenger side of the Mercedes. Vivian did not recognize him. He was perhaps 50, in a sport coat, carrying a leather portfolio, and he had the faintly anxious face of a lawyer who has been hired on short notice and is not yet sure what he has been hired for. "Vivian," Howard said, "this is Marcus Beale. He's a colleague of mine. He's reviewed the settlement, and he believes there may have been an oversight. We need to talk." She looked at Marcus Beale. He had the decency to look away. "There was no oversight, Howard. The property was undervalued. The property was valued by your lawyer at $6,000. Your lawyer wrote that number. I have the document." "Yes, but the contents, Vivian said, "are not on the deed. The contents have been held in trust for me by my father since 1981. My lawyer pulled the addendum 2 weeks before our settlement hearing. It was not a community asset, Howard. It never was. My father made sure of that 12 years into our marriage." Howard's mouth moved before any sound came out of it. "I don't," he started. "What addendum?" "The one you didn't read," Vivian said. "Because you didn't read this file. Because you called it the Firewood Farm and you laughed about it, and you never once in 11 years drove up here to look at what was inside the building. Earl Whitfield could have told you. Earl was here the whole time. You could have asked. You never asked. Earl, at the corner of the workshop, did not turn his head, but Vivian saw him stop moving. Tom Reedy on the roof did not stop moving, because Tom Reedy was a professional, but the rhythm of his hammer changed by exactly 1 beat. "What's in the building?" Howard said. "My father's work, Howard. 51 years of it. Pieces he was paid in. Pieces he bought. Pieces he saved. How much?" "Howard, how much, Vivian?" "That's not your question to ask anymore." The lawyer, Marcus Beale, cleared his throat. "Mr. Carlisle, perhaps we should—" "How much?" Howard said again. He had not raised his voice. He had done something worse. He had lowered it, the way he had always lowered it when he wanted a room to know he was the most serious person in it. Vivian had stopped being afraid of the lowered voice somewhere around the 3rd day in the Subaru. "The last appraisal my father had done," she said, "in 2014, on 11 of the major pieces, came in at $2.1 million. Marcus Beale made a small sound. Howard did not. Howard's face did something Vivian had never seen it do. It aged. Not metaphorically. Visibly. A man losing 7 years in front of her, on the gravel of her father's drive, in the late October light. "There are 46 pieces total," she said, "fully cataloged by my mother. The current full appraisal, which I'll have on Tuesday, will be considerably higher. There's a tall case clock my father wouldn't let anyone appraise because he said the clock wasn't for selling. I'm going to honor that. The rest is mine to do with as I see fit. This is a community asset, Vivian. We were married. Anything acquired before 1981, Howard, By my father. Held in trust. In my name only. Patricia has the documents. Your lawyer reviewed them. He signed off on the settlement. He even initialed the page. He just didn't know what was on the other side of that locked door. Neither did you. Howard turned to Marcus Beale. Marcus Beale was already shaking his head, very slightly, the head shake of a lawyer who has just understood the case he has been brought up here for, and has understood that the case is not going to be argued. Mr. Carlyle, Marcus said quietly, if what she's saying is correct about the addendum, we have no standing here. It's correct, Vivian said. Patricia Olmsted in Asheville. You can call her Monday. She'll send you a copy. Howard stood on the gravel for a long moment. He looked at the barn. He looked at the sign. He looked at Earl Whitfield, who had turned now, and who was watching Howard with the patient, steady attention of a man who had worked for a better man for 30 years and could spot the difference at 50 paces. You knew, Howard said to her. All those years. You knew. No, Howard. That's the part you don't understand. I didn't know. Nobody told me. My father set it up to protect me from a man he didn't trust. And my mother kept the secret because my father asked her to, and Earl kept the building because my mother asked him to. They all kept it from me without telling me, because they all thought I might need it one day, and they were right. She stood up from the porch chair. The porch chair creaked the way it had creaked in 1973. You should go now, Howard, she said. You'll want to be on the road before dark. The mountain roads aren't kind of nice cars. He went. The Mercedes turned around in the gravel and went back down the drive, slower than it had come up, and Marcus Beale did not look at her through the passenger window, and Howard did not look at her through the driver's window, and the dust hung in the late afternoon light for a long time after the car had disappeared around the curve. Earl Whitfield walked over to the porch. He stood at the bottom of the steps with his hands in his pockets. You handled that, he said. Did I? You handled that just fine. Vivian sat back down in the chair. Her hands were shaking. She had not noticed them shaking until now. Earl noticed. Earl pretended not to notice, which was the right thing to do, and he sat down on the top step with his back against the porch post, and they watched the men on the roof finish the last row of tar paper before the light went. The shop opened the following April. The sign at the road was the same sign Tom Reedy's crew had hung in October, W. Hale and Daughter Restoration, but it had been re-lettered by a sign painter from Spruce Pine who had done sign work for Walter 40 years earlier and had agreed to come out of retirement for one more job. He had not charged her. He had said it was an honor. Vivian had understood, by then, that the people who had loved her father had been waiting for someone to give them a reason to do something for him again, and that all she had to do was give them the chance. The first piece that came in was a Sheraton card table from a family in Charleston who had heard, somehow, that the Hale shop was open again. The second was a corner cupboard from a collector in Atlanta. The third was a desk that had belonged to a federal judge in Raleigh, and the family had been holding it for 6 years waiting for a restorer they trusted. By the end of the first summer, Vivian had a 6-month waiting list and was turning away work she did not have time for, and Earl Whitfield was working 4 days a week, and 2 younger men, Tom Reedy's nephew and a young woman from Mars Hill named Hannah Green who had studied conservation at a school up north and come home looking for a master to learn under, had been added to the bench. Vivian sold 3 of the smaller pieces from the back room in the second year, through an auction house in Philadelphia that did not advertise her name. The proceeds restored the house, paid off the renovation on the barn, set up a scholarship in Walter Hale's name at the Penland School of Crafts 12 miles down the road, and left enough to ensure that the shop could operate at a loss for 10 years if it had to and never close. The shop did not operate at a loss. The shop, by the 3rd year, was paying for itself. The tall case clock stayed in the back room. She wound it once a week on Sunday mornings the way her father had wound it. It was accurate to the minute, as it had always been. Caroline came up to visit in the second summer. Caroline was 37 and had not, during the divorce, taken a side, because Caroline had never taken a side in anything in her life and had always considered this her best quality. She arrived in a rental car and stayed for 3 days, and on the second day, she came out to the workshop and stood in the doorway and watched her mother sand a chair a leg. And she said, "Mom, I didn't know you knew how to do this." "You never asked," Vivian said. She did not say it harshly. She said it the way her father might have said it. As a fact, Caroline was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Will you teach me?" Vivian looked up from the chair leg. She looked at her daughter, standing in the doorway in clothes that were not appropriate for a workshop, with her hair tied back the way Vivian had used to tie her own hair back at the same age, and she felt, for the first time in many years, the specific feeling of a door opening that she had thought was closed. Saturday mornings, Vivian said. 8 o'clock. Were clothes you don't mind ruining. Caroline came every other Saturday for the next 4 years. Daniel, the older one, never came. Vivian wrote Daniel a letter on his 43rd birthday, telling him that the door was open if he ever wanted to walk through it. Daniel did not write back. Vivian had decided, by then, that some doors stay open and some doors stay closed, and a person's job was not to force either, only to make sure that the door on her end was the one that stayed open. Daniel knew where she was. Daniel could come when he was ready. If he never was, that was Daniel's loss, and Vivian had spent enough years of her life carrying losses that did not belong to her. Howard remarried within 18 months. The woman was 31 years younger than him. The marriage lasted 4 years. The lake house was sold in the divorce. Vivian heard about it from Patricia Olmsted, who heard about it from a colleague in Asheville, and Vivian did not go and look at the listing online because she did not need to, because the lake house had never been hers and had never been the point. Earl Whitfield retired in the 7th year, at 67, and stayed on as a part-time consultant who came in 2 days a week and complained about the radio station Hannah Green played and brought in donuts on Fridays. Hannah, by then, was running the bench. Vivian had moved upstairs to the loft her father had used as an office, and she did the appraisals and the client relationships and the writing, because the writing had become a thing in the 5th year when a magazine in New York had asked her to write a short piece about her father's methods for restoring 18th century chair joints, and the short piece had become a column, and the column had become, in the 8th year, a book. The book was called The Barn He Left Me. It sold modestly. It was reviewed in 3 trade journals. It sat on a shelf in the workshop next to the green binder with her mother's handwriting on the spine, and Vivian did not need it to sell more than that, because the book was not the point either. The point was the chair on the stand in the corner of the workshop. The walnut-side chair her father had finished in the last 6 months of his life, with the help of an apprentice who had grown into his face by 40. The chair stayed where Walter had left it. Vivian had decided, in her first week back, that the chair was not for sale and not for restoration and not for display, except in the sense that it was the first thing every visitor saw when they walked through the side door, and the last thing every visitor looked at when they walked out. The card was still in her pocket. She moved it from jacket to jacket as the seasons changed. If you're reading this, you came home. I'm sorry it took what it took. There is more to find. Take your time. She had taken her time. She had found what was there to find. And the shop at the end of the dirt road, the shop that Howard Carlyle had once called a firewood farm, had become, slowly, quietly, in the way real things become themselves, one of the last working restoration shops of its kind in the southern Appalachians, a place where 18th century furniture came home to be made well again, by hands that had been taught by hands that had been taught by Walter Hale. On a Tuesday morning in October, 11 years to the day after she had stood in front of the brass handle on the side door for the first time, Vivian Carlyle stood in the workshop with a cup of coffee and watched the early light come through the high windows and the long slanted bars she had watched as a child. The chair was on the stand. The clock in the back room was ticking. Hannah Green was at the bench, working on the splat of a queen and side chair that had come in from a family in Savannah. Earl Whitfield was on the porch of the house, drinking coffee with Tom Reedy and complaining about something. Caroline was due up that weekend. The leaves were past their peak, but still gold in the patches where the sun came through. Vivian stood in the doorway and felt, in her chest, the quiet completeness of a woman who had been told for 41 years what her life was worth, and who had walked, eventually, into a building that nobody had bothered to look inside, and had found in it the answer her father had been keeping for her, and had kept, ever since, the answer she had eventually found for herself. What is left behind is never truly gone. The right hands will always find it. Thank you for sitting with this story all the way to the end. The people who stay for the whole story are the ones who understand it. If it moved you, the videos on your screen right now are waiting to do the same. And if you haven't subscribed yet, come home. Left Behind has a story for you.